All right there, everyone. Are we seeing the beginnings of a Christian revival in Europe? That's what John D. Martin over at the Federalist believes, and he makes quite a good argument for it. That's what we'll be talking about on today's video. John Martin has an excellent article that came out a few weeks back that walks us through why it is that he believes we are in fact seeing what he calls a real and sustained revival of Christian-themed enthusiasm in Europe, which is hardly reported on at all and barely noticed by the European press. But it does appear to be very real and very, very impressive. He begins first with Spain, where he cites a 2014 study that found significant increases in the percentage of Spaniards who were attending Catholic Mass. Church attendance rose from 12% in 2011 to 15% in the following year, 2012. But that was just the beginning. Between 2012 and 2013, church attendance grew by another astonishing 23%. And when you look at the number of Spaniards who voluntarily support the church through their taxes, those numbers rose by over 1 million between 2007 and 2013. So church attendance and participation is on a very significant uptick in Spain. He then jumps all the way over to Eastern Europe and again cites reports of Christian revivals going on in Viktor Orban's Hungary, as well as a massive surge in church attendance in Poland, which exceeds today over 40% of the population. Poland, of course, formally declared Jesus Christ as Lord and King over their nation in a ceremony in the presence of President Andrzej Duda back in November 2016. In Russia, a number of studies have corroborated that there's nothing less than a mass Christian revival going on there in the former Soviet Union. For example, in 1991, only 37% of the Russian population identified as Orthodox Christians. Today, it's over 70%. And it's not just Russia. In 1991, only 39% of Ukrainians identified as Orthodox. Today, it's over 80%. Back in the 90s, 60% of Bulgarians identified as Orthodox Christians. Today, it's 75%. So it's clearly cool to be an Orthodox Christian right now in Eastern Europe. And a number of surveys have found that over 90% of people in Greece and Romania and Moldova, Armenia, Georgia all said that they believe in God and affirm a distinctive Christian identity. Next, John Martin heads on over to France and looks at data there. And here he finds that the numbers of vocations and calls to the priesthood and religious life in the various Catholic orders, they've all been increasingly. And interestingly, we're seeing the rise of evangelical churches in both Catholic Spain and France. In France, in particular, statistics show that a new evangelical church opens, get this, every 10 days in France. Over 30 evangelical churches in France have congregations of 1,000 or more. Just in the last 60 years, the number of evangelical Protestants has increased tenfold. And what this fellow, John Martin, has found is that the European church is actually very, very young in terms of its congregants. The whole notion that the European church is aging and dying and collapsing just doesn't fit with the actual demographics of church attendees. We're seeing this particularly with events like Awakening Europe, where tens of thousands of young people gather together to worship and hear evangelistic preaching. The latest one in Prague saw over 1,000 young people commit their lives to Christ for the very first time. A similar event with similar mass numbers of conversions happened over in Stockholm, Sweden as well. Now, Martin lives in Germany, and so much of the article focuses on the events and statistics happening close to home for him. And one stat that was very impressive is the amount of baptisms that took place in the Evangelical Church of Germany in 2016. At a national level, the Evangelical Church received nearly 200,000 new members in that year alone. And then when you bring in the charismatic and Pentecostal numbers to bear in all this, we're seeing a growth of 6% in those churches over the last 2 years as well. Moreover, there's something called the Mayor Conference, Mayor meaning more as in more of Christ. And the conference held this year drew more than 11,000 attendees, which was a 100-fold increase from its first conference back in 2008. And again, we're seeing here a very vibrant young Christianity. At the last Mayor Conference, the moderators asked everyone who was younger than 22 to stand up, and reports were that nearly half of the 11,000 in attendance stood up. I mean, this is a young and vibrant church. Now, of course, if you're a frequent viewer of this channel, this is not going to surprise you. And this, of course, is because one of the major themes of this channel is a phenomenon that we track on a regular basis that's occurring all over the world, a phenomenon that scholars call re-traditionalization. Now, for those of you who do not know this term, re-traditionalization is a rather simple concept. But again, from the vantage point of this channel, it's vital to understand if you want to appreciate just why a new conservative age truly is rising in our midst throughout the world. Basically, it works like this. In the face of threats to a sense of place, identity, and security, posed particularly by globalization, populations tend to reassert historic identity and security markers, their religion, their customs, and traditions as mechanisms of resistance against secular globalization's anti-cultural, anti-traditional dynamics. Scholars are increasingly noting that as people feel vulnerable and experience existential anxiety, it's not uncommon for them to assert their customs, their traditions, their culture, their language, their ethnicity, and their religion as bulwarks against threats to their sense of existential security. And so the anti-traditionalist dynamics inherent in globalization have elicited a renewed interest in a culture's ancient traditions of wisdom and virtue that have proved their validity through the test of time. And these, of course, tend to be found in the great historic religions and spiritual traditions and practices that seem to transcend history and therefore can be valued as authentic resources for not only resisting the anti-cultural, anti-traditional processes of globalization, but also as a basis for the spiritual renewal of a nation, culture, and people. The important thing here to get is that re-traditionalization is not limited to just private, personal, or communal religious experience. It involves a reconfiguration of political, cultural, and social norms around pre-modern religious beliefs and practices as a response to the secularizing processes of globalization. So now, as we've noted in video after video, there's no question that we're seeing nationalism and populism on the rise throughout Europe. But what many scholars miss is that an essential part of that revitalized nationalism and populism is a re-traditionalization that provides the spiritual roots that serve to revitalize and sustain the resurgence of nationalist populism. This is precisely what we are seeing in Europe. It really does appear that we are seeing nothing less than a mass religious awakening. Indeed, a Christian revival going on throughout Europe that is effectively countering the secularizing globalism on the one hand, and of course the incessant Islamization of Europe with unfettered immigration on the other. John Martin's article compiles but the latest evidence that there is a dramatic spiritual shift taking place in Europe toward the renewal and growth in all branches of Christianity. A spiritual shift that is reawakening a new conservative age in our midst. As always, please like, comment, and subscribe. Click on our Patreon link below and become a monthly supporter of this channel. And help us to continue to analyze current events in light of conservative trends so that you can personally and professionally flourish. God bless.